All right, let's get into the story of a former hacktivist who goes by the name Dexter. Now, this isn't your typical story about data breaches or anything like that. Instead, this is a really raw look at one person's search for identity, for a place to belong, and maybe even a little atonement, told mostly in his own words. This is how Dexter describes himself. Right off the bat, he's not using any of the typical hacker labels you might have heard of, the hats that are supposed to tell you about their ethics. He uses just one word: criminal. And that one word, it just forces you to throw all those simple labels out the window and get ready for something a lot more complex. At its core, this whole story is about something we can all relate to: that search for a tribe. It's about that deep, deep need to belong somewhere, and the sometimes painful discovery that the family you thought you found might not be a family after all. So, you might be wondering, where did a story like this even come from? What's so fascinating is that it didn't come out on some secret dark web forum. It all unfolded in a very open conversation on a platform called the Cyber Midnight Club, hosted by Alberto Daniel Hill. And you have to understand, a space like this is so important. What Alberto Daniel Hill has built is this rare, judgment-free zone where people can tell these incredibly complex stories without being immediately condemned. Dexter himself said it gave him a voice to talk about things he just couldn't anywhere else. Honestly, without that space, we probably wouldn't even have this story to tell. So why? Why would someone dive headfirst into a chaotic, decentralized collective like Anonymous? Well, for Dexter, the answer wasn't really about politics or activism, not at first anyway. It was something way more personal. To really get it, you gotta look at his backstory. He grew up in a really hostile environment, and he actually witnessed a murder when he was just 11 years old. I mean, that kind of trauma, it sticks with you. And it created this crazy paradox inside him. He hated being in groups, but at the same time, he was desperately searching for a family, for that sense of real unity. And Anonymous, with its whole promise of a shared cause, it looked like the perfect answer. And man, his rise within the group was just crazy fast. For about 10 years, he was just an orbiter, kind of watching from the sidelines. But then, early 2020 hits, and he and his crew, the Federation, they jump in feet first. And his rise was just meteoric. He gets a public shout-out from a big name like Commander X, and then his profile totally explodes when his crew starts doing humanitarian aid for protesters on the ground. He went from a nobody to a somebody in less than a year. Okay, so he's rising through the ranks, he's getting noticed. But that's when the ideal he was chasing started to clash with the messy reality of it all. The family he thought he'd found, well, it started to show some serious cracks. He went in looking for unity, for people fighting for the same cause. But what he actually found was a culture that was becoming more and more about, in his own words, petty infighting and ego fagging. It was all about people trying to get status and clout, not about the actual mission. The whole collective was just fracturing. And two things in particular really just hammered this point home for him. First, there was the case of Vanessa Guillen, a missing soldier. He and his crew were all in, ready to go. But when they asked the bigger Anonymous community for help, nothing. Crickets. Then you had this big cultural shift. A whole new wave of members, a lot of them finding Anonymous through TikTok, came flooding in. And they seemed more interested in online fame than anything else. And then you get the final straw. A friend's family was being viciously targeted in this huge online harassment campaign. I mean, this was a textbook Anonymous case, right? Defending the defenseless. This was supposed to be their bread and butter. His crew planned this massive, all-hands-on-deck operation. They put out the call to action and were met with total silence. Some people even said it wasn't worth their time. In that one moment, as Dexter puts it, the whole illusion just shattered. The family, the support, it wasn't real. And that very same night, his entire crew, completely disillusioned, officially walked away from the Anonymous banner for good. So what do you do when the one thing that gave you purpose is gone? Well, for Dexter, you find a new one. And this is where his story takes a turn into a fascinating and, let's be honest, a deeply controversial new chapter. All right, so let's break down exactly how this business of his worked. A client who was actively cheating on their partner would hire him. The job? To frame the client's partner and make them look like the one who was unfaithful.
Dexter's team would create a whole fake trail of digital evidence. We're talking fake texts, cloned social media accounts, you name it, so that the actual cheater could walk away from the relationship looking like the victim.
But here's the twist. Dexter had this one single rule. He would only take the job if the person they were framing was also cheating on their partner. Now, it's a weird kind of vigilante logic, for sure. It doesn't exactly make the whole thing clean, but it definitely adds another layer of complication to it all. And it's easy to think, okay, so this was just about the money. But that's not the whole picture. Not even close. The profits from this seriously questionable business, they were being funneled into a completely separate, secret mission. The money from helping frame cheaters was directly bankrolling his operations to hunt down online predators and protect kids from abusers. This was a cause he was incredibly passionate about, and it was rooted in his own childhood trauma of almost being kidnapped. It also paid for his college education. So he was living this unbelievable double life, one foot deep in a moral gray area and the other fighting for something he saw as pure good. So that brings us pretty much up to today. He's left the collective, he's done with the framing business, and now he's on a whole new journey, just trying to figure out who he is without a mask or a group to hide behind. But going public is messy. After a big YouTube interview, a public conflict blew up between him and a former ally at Spiderbite over how some past events were being remembered and retold. Now, we're not here to pick sides, but it's just a perfect example of how complicated things get when you step out of the shadows and try to own your own story. And this brings us right back to that word from the beginning, atonement. For Dexter, this isn't about apologizing or asking for forgiveness for his past. He owns it, all of it. For him, atonement means something completely different. His way of atoning is to take control of his own narrative. He does that by writing his whole story out for everyone to see on, of all places, GitHub, and by speaking so openly on platforms like Cyber Midnight Club. It's almost like a form of therapy and a new kind of activism all rolled into one, just owning his story, flaws and all. And this all comes together in his final, really powerful reflection on his time with Anonymous. He doesn't see it as a failure. He compares the whole collective to a computer system protocol. And just like any system, it's always going to have bugs. But in this case, they're human bugs. So his journey, his disillusionment, even him leaving, it wasn't a failure of the system. In his mind, the system worked exactly like it was supposed to. It gave him purpose, and then it forced him to outgrow it. And that kind of leaves us with one last question to think about. For him, and really for anyone who's ever identified with a group or worn a mask, when you finally take it all off, what's actually left? It's a question about identity that goes way, way beyond the world of hacking.